I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. And you can stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments. We also want you to know that we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode, I want to welcome celebrated actor in over 160 films and Emmy award-winning narrator in over 200 documentaries and audiobooks, Peter Coyote, who is also a Pushcart Award winner as an author and wrote a couple of memoirs, Sleeping Where I Fall and The Rain Man's Last Cure. He's a former member of the Diggers and the San Francisco Mime Troupe. He's also an ordained Buddhist priest who recently published a book titled Zen in the Vernacular. We'll talk about that and much more. In fact, I want to see if we can talk about the acting career, the narrator career, and also his Zen Buddhist life as a teacher now of Zen. And there are many other incarnations and avatars that he's had as well. He's a graduate of Grinnell College, in San Francisco State, and a friend of your humble host for many years, and I'm delighted to be in dialogue with him, our venerable, multi-talented Gray Matter with Michael Krasny guest. Welcome, Peter Coyote.
I'm so thrilled because I've caught you in the first mistake in all the years I've known you. The name of my second book is called The Rain Man's Third Cure, not The Last Cure.
Ah, well, the third might have been the last, but thank you for that correction. I stand to be corrected a lot of the time, though. This is just a fallacy people have about me. I also want to congratulate you on a recent marriage to a lovely and clearly wonderful woman. And thought we would talk about the Trinity for the most part, your Trinity, Buddhist teacher and important figure in the whole world of Zen Buddhism, also voice of Ken Burns documentaries and so many other things. And let's talk about acting first, because I haven't talked with you much about your acting career. And there are an extraordinary number of movies and TV shows and TV films, some of them pretty big-name movies like E.T. and Aaron Brockovich and Jagged Edge, where you portray a character named Krasny, thanks to Joe Esterhazy wanting revenge, I think, against me, but that's another story.
I think that's how we met, or it was around that time.
Around that time, yeah, it was how we met. But is there any single appearance or role that you assumed that has stayed with you or that you would like to stay with you in terms of maybe a time capsule or something like that? In other words, something that's so prominent in your memory that it's preeminent.
Well, this is a complex issue for me because I became an actor so that I wouldn't have to write for money. That shows you how practical I am. And I discovered in short order, I didn't get my Screen Actors Guild card until I was 39. And so I had a short run as a leading man and then a much longer run as a character actor. And if you don't get the girl, you don't get the checks. But I never considered myself a great actor. I knew I was not going to make the top rank. I was never going to be Daniel Day-Lewis or Meryl Streep or Sean Penn. And I did my best, and it won me a great life and sent me around the world. But there's only a few of the movies I ever made that really stuck with me. And I would say I've only seen about a third of the movies I made. Makes me very uncomfortable to see myself. The one movie that was maybe the closest to my character was called A Man in Love, and it was made in France by Diane Curis, and it was a huge hit in France, and it turned me into the modern-day Jerry Lewis. It put me on the cover of every magazine in Europe, and it was a big deal. And both people who saw it in America thought it was quite good. But the American publicity was so wretched that I don't blame anyone for not going to see it. But it's an interesting film. Sphere was an interesting film with Barry Levinson. Cross Creek was fun to do. E.T. was fun to do. But basically, I characterize most of them as mortgage, tuition, or what is it that you have to pay an ex-wife? Alimony.
Yeah, you had a little memory lapse about that word.
Yes, I did.
You say you don't like to see yourself necessarily on films. You like to hear yourself when you do the voiceovers and narratives?
No, but most people find their own voices shocking and a little repulsive. I've listened to my own voice enough that I'm completely used to it, and I can hear it pretty clinically. It's not that I like it, although I have been accused of liking it too much sometimes.
Well, the voice has stayed pretty much the same, the mellifluous quality of your voice. I feel my voice is getting kind of ragged as I age with entropy or whatever is devastating and deteriorating it. But the reality is your voice sounds pretty much intact to me.
I inherited my mother's voice box, and my mother was a really interesting woman. She was a very elegant, very glamorous little Jewish girl from the Bronx whose family ran a little 3-stool soda fountain. And from about the age of 11, she groomed herself to be the wife of a wealthy man. She would go to Saks Fifth Avenue and she'd study the shop girls and the customers. She was Walter Winchell's secretary. For a certain point, she was a model. And she lived in a kind of her own personal film noir. She had a wonderful voice and sort of a North Atlantic accent. "That's lovely, darling. How lovely to see you." When she came to visit me once, somebody offered her a joint and she said, "No, I prefer my Viceroy, thank you."
Well, there's some great stories about your parents, and they certainly instilled in you a strong political viewpoint, to put it mildly. And that goes back to your role in the Diggers. And I know they're still caring for older men who were, and women, I guess, who were at least associated with the Diggers. The 60s counterculture lives on in many ways in you. And I wonder, and so do your family's politics. I wonder if you still have these attitudes about private property being wrong and profit being maybe too much, zealously driving too many people and all that?
Well, I think nothing on the face of it except cruelty is inherently wrong. I mean, capitalism seems to be a pretty good system in those countries where it's regulated. And so in most European countries, it's regulated. And the Americans have no idea what socialism is. Socialism is capitalism with rules. Socialism is where the people say, yeah, we know how to make money, but we're going to cordon off a certain number of things that we want to work at a break-even basis. We don't want health care to make a profit. We don't want electricity and utilities to make a profit. We don't want mass transit to make a profit. And the rest can be open to entrepreneurs. But my political life actually started in the 40s and 50s because in my mother's family, there were communists and socialists who were ruined by the McCarthy period. And I was enraged by listening to my government lying about my relatives, who were like old Jewish schlamazels, spilling cream cheese in their lap and saying things like, that Trotsky was a man, Stalin, he was a pig. They couldn't have pushed over a push cart. And yet they were transmitted to the United States as threats. And what they did was they created a ham-handed aversion to all politics left of neoliberalism, left of unregulated capitalism. And we're bearing the fruits of it now with the greatest spread between incomes equal to Saudi Arabia. We have 1,000 billionaires in the country, and 50% of the country is barely making it, one paycheck away from a disaster. So it's not that I'm anti-capitalist, I'm anti-political systems that are run and organized around money, which is the unspeakable subject.
Therefore, be more in favor of something of a collectivist type of system?
No, I'm not particularly a collectivist, but I think if I've lived in England, I've lived in France, I've lived in Italy, I've lived in Spain and worked, and it just seems to me a little more adult, a little less brutal. People in France are not homeless unless they want to be. You can call a doctor in France and he'll come to your house for $20. And if you need a lab, he'll send a lab over for $20. And with the basis taken care of, the French, for instance, have a lot more disposable income. They eat out 3 meals a day sometimes. They're not afraid of each other. Everyone you pass on the street is paying taxes to take care of you if you're ill. So it's not that I want to say collectivist or not collectivist, but we live in a Darwinian, some kind of 19th century understanding of what cooperation is.
But you lived in and had a very strong identity with communes.
I did.
So that must have affected you and had an impact on it. And the Diggers were collectivists, really trying to do as much as they could for other people without any expense or profit, as much as they could possibly.
Well, we did, and a lot of the Digger values were very good. There's 105 of us who are still chipping in money every month to take care of about 15 of us that got old and indigent. But in order for communal or collectivist work to collectivist life to work, you have to work on yourself. And you have to understand that in most cases, you are the problem you're trying to solve. And the traumas and the ignorance and the greed and the envy and the competitiveness you bring with you is going to affect the collective body politic. And so it's one of the things that drove me to Buddhist study. You know, I'd be sitting in a room with people screaming at one another about peace. And I realized at a certain point that I was one of them, and I was creating the problems I was purporting to solve. So 50 years later, I can look at Buddhism as a reliable indicator or a reliable reliable narrator of the self. Gives you a clearer view of what you're actually doing in the world as opposed to what you think you're doing.
But isn't the self in Buddhism just a kind of awareness, or the idea is there's no separate self? Here we live in a very solipsistic world in the West where the belief is suddenly of many people that there's no reality except the self. I mean, Trump's been accused of being a solipsist, for example, but a very different view when you take it from a Buddhist perspective.
Yes, so Buddha's fundamental insight was called dependent origination, and it meant that everything was dependent on everything else. You and I appear to be separate people. That's true, but that's only half the story, because you and I have never been separate from oxygen, from sunlight, from microbes in the soil growing our food, from the people who planted the cotton and grew the cotton and spun the cotton and sewed the cotton for your shirts and your pants. And so the other half of the story is that we're all like ticks on the body of a dog. And so the self, yes, the self is an awareness, but we're brought up to believe that the self is in here. It's a separate integer from the rest of the universe. And what can that do but make us feel tiny and insignificant and want power and wealth and defenses? And once you realize that you're inevitably connected to everything, you realize you can't get bigger. You can't get more powerful than all of it. And it relieves you of a lot of panic and anxiety.
Well, much to talk about in that vein, and I hope we can get into it. But I get back to your influences early on. You also lived the life of an addict. I mean, in fact, used heroin. And my puzzling question is how all that affected you and tied in with your present Buddhist. I mean, you're an ordained Buddhist priest now. Well, there's been a kind of evolution, clearly.
Yeah, I'm a step above that. I'm what's called a transmitted teacher.
Right.
Which is that my teacher has made me independent, and I've ordained my own priests and my own, the person who will succeed me.
Your life is about service, but when you're an addict, it's about really getting your next fix for the most part, isn't it?
You know, most of us have some kind of a feral junkyard dog in our psyche that's a pitiless judge, unforgiving. It's the aunt of a dominant mother or father or aunt or school teacher that scared the hell out of us. And growing up with that voice, sometimes it's intolerable. And the one thing to be said about heroin is that it shuts everything down. I wasn't aware that it was also giving me hepatitis C. It would make me ill for 45 years. It would take away any semblance of a real life. But it seemed like a pursuit. The Diggers were inventing a future and making it real by acting it out. And if you're doing that, at some point the question's going to occur to you, hey, suppose I'm just running around in the loony bin I've been given permission to run around in. Suppose the establishment has already gotten hold of my imagination and so trained me from kindergarten through grade school through college that I think my indulgences are freedom. So my excuse or the justification for getting into heroin and methadone was to think these things are so outlawed, nobody's going to give me permission to do this. This is what the Vietnam vets were doing. This is what Billie Holiday was doing.
So forgive me, it was defiance, huh?
Yeah. Defiance and wanting, and also a test of, was I going far enough to escape from the system? Because I didn't understand that whatever you're running away from, you stay bound to. No matter how far you go east, you know where west is. So it took me some time, and the real problem was a series of very, very difficult dilemmas with my father and my mother. My mom was crushed with depression for a number of years, completely unavailable. My dad was a very dangerous, very violent, very brilliant guy, went to MIT at 15, and a really interesting man, but not a very good father. And I had a lot to work out before I could settle down and accept myself. And that took it only took 30 years of psychotherapy and 50 years of Zen, but I got to some stable platform.
Well, here's a question from one of our regular listeners, Reed, who says, Peter, and thanks for the question, Reed, are you still politically engaged? Obviously, the answer has been provided for us already. But then he says, I'm sure your Zen practice gives you equanimity in the shifting sands of politics. Would that be an accurate statement? Do you find equanimity?
No. Zen Buddhism gives you equanimity in the shifting sands of everything. But still, in this world of form, this world of apparent self and other, we have to deal with contradictions. We have to accept, for most of its history, Buddhism was under the tutelage or the permission of a king or an emperor or royalty, so no Buddhist teachers could risk going against them if they wanted their temples or their monks to survive. So when Buddhism came to the West, we had a great advantage for the first time because we were free of the oppression of royalty. And we had, Gary Snyder called psychology the compassion of the West. And so we had a chance to look and understand that there are social systems that increase suffering, and there are social systems that don't. And if we take these vows to save and be of aid and comfort to all beings, how can we not look at social systems which contribute to suffering? If you are working 3 jobs to survive and you're $500 away from bankruptcy, you are not in a system where you have any time to think or meditate or do anything but barely keep your nose above rising water. And that's a man-made event. That's not because you're stupid or careless or don't work hard. That's because the system is, to quote Donald Trump, rigged. But it's rigged not in the way he says it. It's rigged for him. It's rigged for the wealthy. It's rigged to protect great fortunes and capital. And it doesn't have to be rigged so extremely.
Well, you've always been about change and maybe even a kind of subversive attitude toward the necessity for change. And I think that still harkens back, even in your new role as a major teacher and provider of comfort and safety and security for many who come to you now in your role as a teacher. I just think from time to time, though, and I wonder what your thoughts are as well, how this translates, because you say these ancient teachings give us a real perspective that we can understand in our own modern and contemporary times. And you talk about radical optimism, for example, and I'm all for a radical optimism, but I wonder how you can be radically optimistic in light of the reality of politics, or in light of climate change, or in light of entropy, or in light of, I use the word lightly here to be sure, the kind of things that are going on with respect to nuclear weapons and their acquisition. I don't want to put a bleak face on all of this, but there's a play by Carol Churchill, which a great British dramatist who I'm sure you know, where she almost makes fun of Buddhism, and she says, this idea that somebody's in a house and it's on fire and you have to go save them. Why should you do that? Nothing means anything. Everything's in flux. Everything's impermanent. So why would I even bother saving this person? Kind of bears down on, I guess, what I'm getting at here. Let me ask you how this radical optimism can tie in just because of the fact that there is change, that things are mutable.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But first I have to explain to your listeners what radical optimism means, because it's my term. And radical optimism is based on one incontrovertible fact, which is that we never know how things are going to turn out. So given that, if I make myself powerful and stay cheerful, which is my most powerful state, I can keep my work up, I can keep my shoulder to the wheel, and there's a chance that things could break my way. It's like buying a lottery ticket. Maybe a long chance, but there's a chance. If I surrender to depression or angst or anger or any of those things, and I stop just pushing forward and teaching and sharing perspectives, there's no chance I'm going to win. So the universe itself is half positive and half negative. It's everything. And there's always as much death as there is life. There's always as much negative capacity as there is positive. There's an infinity of both. So the idea that we can feed one and diminish the other is just an illusion. There was a wonderful Zen master in the 13th century named Fuketsu, and he gave a little Dharma talk called A Speck of Dust. And the Dharma talk was this: if you pick up a speck of dust, the nation prospers. If you don't pick it up, nothing happens. End of Dharma talk. So what he meant was this: picking up a speck of dust is doing anything next to the immensity of the universe, saving the last whale, building a Zen temple, creating world peace, creating a victorious democratic party. There are some of us who cannot just look at the world suffering and do nothing, so we pick up the speck of dust. There are other people who can look at it, and they don't pick up the speck of dust and nothing changes. But for those of us who do pick up the speck of dust, there's one very important thing Fuketsu pointed out. You have to remember that you pick up the whole world. You don't pick up just your good intentions. So you pick up greed, hate, delusion, avarice, competition. So for every good thing you do, you'll be doing several bad things or unhealthy things. So the answer is not to be enthusiastic and to run off like Donald Rumsfeld and say, we're going into Iraq, we'll take the oil will pay for the war, we'll set up a democracy, it'll be a piece of cake. Oh, never thought of IEDs. So the way that one behaves in the face of total change and uncertainty is like a fox. You take a couple steps forward, you sniff the air, you say, is the plan still working? Okay, you take another couple of steps forward. You sniff the air again, and you adjust little by little by little. So David Harris once said, values that are not expressed in action don't exist.
Well, a speck of dust makes me think of butterfly wings and, all those sorts of notions of physics and all. You mentioned David Harris. I know he was a close friend of yours. And
he was a very close friend, yeah.
How do you deal with loss in the sense of, I know you take the word dukkha's, which means suffering in many people's minds, but you give it a whole new meaning, affliction, as you deal with the Four Noble Truths and try to essentially bring them into a different context is one of the real values in this new book of yours, which I thoroughly enjoyed and recommend. But I had learned a great deal from him. I want to go back to what I didn't learn, perhaps, but I want to ask you about loss and grieving and how that figures into this radical optimism or taking a speck of dust and just simply moving on with an attitude of fortitude.
Well, let me just quickly run through the Four Noble Truths, because it's the third noble truth that's the kicker. So the very first thing that Buddha ever taught after his enlightenment was the Four Noble Truths. And the first one, he said, was dukkha, and he defined it. Dukkha was birth, death, grieving, pain, illness, being stuck in a situation you don't want to be stuck in, or being denied access to a situation you can't get to. He called it affliction, and it's not your fault. This is not happening to you because you're a bad student or because you're spiritually undeveloped. This is the nature of the world. Everything is being afflicted. Everything is being stressed by a peppered wind. It's the way the universe keeps itself moving. The second noble truth is samudaya. It means arising. When someone cuts you off in a car, fear, anger, revenge, all these things arise. They're both involuntary, the affliction and the arising. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It just happens. The third noble truth is the first one you can do anything about. And it's called nirodha, and it pertains to meditating. But nirodha stands for a clay wall around a fire pit that stops the flames from leaping out into the village or the crops and burning it down. And what you learn is that by sitting and meditating, you can withstand anything that arises. Now, for most people who don't face their bad thoughts or who don't face their grief or their sorrow or their shame, the trouble starts when you run away. You wind up shopping too much, drinking too much, too many drugs, wind up in the wrong bed. Nothing dignified and noble about that. Buddha called these noble truths. And truth, if it means anything, means real, and noble means worthy of dignity. So once you know that you can withstand whatever comes up, you just take the world as it unfolds to you, because most of it's beyond your control. And once you can do that, then the final noble truth is called marga. It's the eightfold path where you model the life of a Buddha in your own life by checking in with yourself when you have to make decisions. Is this right speech? Is this right attitude? Am I doing the right thing for a living? So most people don't know that you can withstand whatever comes up.
And that includes deep grieving and the loss that goes with it and mourning.
Yeah. It's going. You know the story of the woman who came to the Buddha carrying her dead baby and said, "What do I do? What do I do?" He said, "I'll tell you. Give me the baby. I'll hold it. Now I want you to go to the village. I want you to collect a mustard seed from every house that has never experienced death." So he didn't give her nice words or a lecture or a homily. He taught her face on, this is the nature of reality. What we're attached to, we're going to lose. Everything's going to change. Grieving is going to be a part of it, and grieving itself will leave if you have the fortitude and the patience to stick with it.
I've got lots of questions for you, Peter, and I want to go to as many as I can, but
Okay.
You're reminding me of a moment in my life when I was 17 years old and I was studying Buddhism just out of interest. And I said to my parents, because parents were obviously the authorities, I said, what can we do about the fact that we're constantly connected to things we don't love and don't want to be connected to, and disconnected from things we love and have to sustain loss throughout life? And my parents said, "I wish we knew, sweetie. I wish we could tell you, because they didn't have any answers for me." And
They must have been Jews, Michael.
But I don't know what I would tell that 17-year-old boy, even now, at this juncture of life. Lots of questions. This is John, who says, how did your early experiences in counterculture movement shape your approach to acting and storytelling? Thank you, John.
So I think the attachment to storytelling starts earlier, starts when you're a child, as you begin to explain things to yourself. I had a very chaotic house. My father was addicted to drugs and violence. I was bailing him out of jail in his 60s for beating younger men senseless. He was like a hand grenade rolled into the house, and everybody would look to see if the pin was pulled or not. So there were a lot of colorful events that happened in my childhood.
I love the story about your father saying he didn't want to box Hemingway because Hemingway was too much of a wuss, basically.
Oh, yeah. That was, yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
He was like that. So I don't know where storytelling came from, but I became kind of addicted to telling stories and making sense of the world by telling stories and teaching by telling stories. The acting comes from both a sense of mimicry and a sense of deep understanding the intentions of people. When I was a kid, sometimes I would go to visit my dad at Wall Street, and I could stand at the top of the Wall Street subway. There was a very, very long escalator, and people would come up to the escalator like a ship coming over the horizon. You'd see their face first, and then their body would appear. And very often the faces would have an expression, like some kind of puzzlement or some kind of anger or something. And I would try to imitate that face and then try to invent a train of thought that could sustain it. So I wasn't just making a face. So somebody comes up and they're looking puzzled and disturbed. I might walk away thinking, where did I leave my keys? I know I left them somewhere. So I don't know. That's just the way I was made. And
well, forgive me, how much is mimicry and how much is maybe taking on the qualities, imaginatively or otherwise, of who and what that person is, like Stanislavski teaches actors to be?
I think it's all true. I think it's all true. And if I had had my way, I would have gone to England and studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, or LAMDA, who I think turn out the greatest actors in the English language. But I already had children, and I couldn't do that by the time I became an actor.
Never too late, Peter. Never too late.
An actor could be a con man or a salesman. Those empathetic impulses and understanding of other people's motives and behavior can express themselves in a lot of occupations, not all of them good.
Who are the great actors in your mind? You mentioned Streep before. Obviously, people always say Brando. Who does Peter Coyote say?
Well, Peter Coyote says Brando, Ralph Richardson, great English actor of the 40s.
Yes.
Meryl Streep, maybe, for my money, the greatest living actor on the planet. Daniel Day-Lewis, Sean Penn. I love to watch actors. There's so many actors I can't even name the list, but I'm not in that company. I'm sort of a PTSD survivor, and it turned out that I had reservoirs of feeling that were no longer accessible to me. And when I tried to reach them as an actor, I couldn't do it. I was a much better acting teacher.
Streep, for example, can do different parts of Poland in terms of accents. I mean, she can sound like she's from one part of Warsaw as opposed to another more rural.
Once you see that soliloquy she did in Sophie's Choice in Polish, begging for the life of her child, you said, I'll watch her instead of being an actor. Yeah, she's just a great gift.
Question from Jeff, who's with us from Miami Beach. Thank you, Jeff. He says, to me, you have a wonderful, unique, and immediately recognizable voice. And how do you approach voice and narration roles versus on-camera roles?
Well, I retired from on-camera roles. As soon as my kids were out of grad school debt-free, I stopped acting. And I picked up the life I always wanted to live as a writer. But I love to do voiceovers, and I had the good fortune to meet and kind of align myself with Ken Burns. And I'll tell you about the way that I do it, because there's a funny story about the first time I ever met Ken. I had done a voiceover series called The West for the young people that produced the Civil War for Ken Burns. And he heard it and he liked it. And so they arranged a meeting. And Ken came into the room and he was carrying a pile of 12 scripts. And on top of it was a pile of 12 DVDs. And next to that was a box of highlighters and a box of pencils and a box of yellow legal pads. He looked like a stationery salesman. And I said, well, what is all that? He said, well, these are the scripts, and these are the DVDs of the 12 series, and this is so you can highlight your lines, and this is so you can make notes. I said, oh, no. I'll just read it when I get in the studio. And there was a really gelid pause, and he said, that will never work. You don't know how impeccable I am. And I said, oh, you don't know how good I am. And then there was another gelid pause. He said, okay, I'll rent a studio for a month and we can try it. I said, no. There's 12 episodes. We're going to do an episode. No, I think it was 9. We're going to do an episode and a half a day. Just rent it for a week. And on day 3, he jumped up and he said, I'll never use anyone else. Well, he has. But, I'm like an idiot savant. I have big breadth of vision. I can see a comma out of the corner of my eye. I can see a period coming up. And, when you do it enough, it's storytelling.
Here's Jerry from Aurora Colorado. If a wealthy man opens a plant in a community and creates several thousand jobs, isn't he doing good for the community as well as gaining wealth?
He may be doing good for the community. So when I was a boy, the average salary of a CEO was 70 times the salary of an average employee. And today it's about 700 times. So when I was a boy, one parent could go to work and support a family and send the kids through college. But now when everybody's concentrating on their personal wealth and CEOs are making 700 times their employees and they're using government money to do stock buybacks to increase their bonuses, they may not be doing well. Yeah, they may be helping people go from paycheck to paycheck, or they could, on the other hand, offer the employees some ownership of the company, like UPS, for instance. So I can't just say categorically that just because you're employing 1,000 people, you're not exploiting them.
A lot more questions, but I want to ask you about something you're doing now. You're involved in a film called Bad Faith, which is also, for those who know Jean-Paul Sartre, a very important concept in Sartre existentialism. But talk about that, because it's something obviously it's of great concern to you. It's fascism again, isn't it? Christian nationalism as you see it?
Yeah, it's got nothing to do with Christ. There was a guy named Paul Weyrich who was a political genius. He started the Heritage Foundation and he started the Council on National Policy. And he got millionaires like the Koch brothers and Richard Scaife, who was a Mellon, and Joseph Coors to pay for it. And what they've done is they've found that in right-wing evangelicals and Pentecostals, they can find the political foot soldiers to motivate them on single-button issues like abortion or anti-homosexuality. And they're using very, very sophisticated computers paid for by the Koch brothers to go into swing counties and swing states. And they have hundreds of radio stations in the Midwest. And we need to remember that as newspapers died out in the Midwest, they were replaced by radio. And the people that owned the radios across the Midwest were basically religious stations. And they've been used by the Paul Weyrichs and the Robert Reeds and these evangelicals to marshal political power. And they will say in this movie, Bad Faith, and you can go to badfaithdocumentary.com and you can see the trailer, or you can see it on Amazon Prime, or for 99 cents, you can see it on YouTube. They basically say, F democracy, we want Christ. And we're going to make you Christians whether you want to or not, which is what the Founding Fathers wanted. And we're going to subjugate all other religions and all other norms to the legacy of the Bible. And there are towns like Redding, California, where these churches have taken over the school board, the library council, the banks. These people are not fooling around.
And they're also not very aware of history. There were too many of the Founding Fathers who were deists or didn't certainly necessarily accept the
But
divinity.
they don't have to. They don't care about being right. They say that. Don't worry about being right. They're hunting power. And so, as I sit and I listen to all these people just parsing Biden's age and performance, and as if this was a contest between two old, unpopular white men, I want to remind them this is an election that's going to determine two different political systems. One is democracy, where if you lose, you can get up and fight again. And the other is autocracy, which is when you lose, you're out of power permanently. And I don't care. I would vote for a horse thief who was a Democrat, as opposed to a grifter who's an autocrat.
Have you read any of the 2025?
Yes, I have. I mean, there you have
900-page document from the Heritage Foundation?
Yeah. The Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich's foundation, has put together 900 pages of their intentions should the next Republican president win office. And they don't even need Trump anymore. Trump's done his job. He's cast aspersions on the law. He's cast aspersions on politics. He's flooded 200 people in the Congress. The next Republican that gets in is going to get rid of civil service and appoint lackeys. They're going to put the FBI under control of the president. They're going to pass anti-LGBTQ, anti-abortion laws. they're going to lock it up into something from the greatest mind of the 19th century could have thought of. And you see this is mentioned in this film, Bad Faith, because this is the kind of background. They're like the American Taliban, the Christian nationalists. They're fascists who are disguising themselves in the role of Jesus.
Another question for you. This is from Bill in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Could the goal of life from a Buddhist or even most religious perspective be the development of one's own soul? The challenges in life of all sizes are the stone or the suffering we sharpen ourselves upon.
Well, that sounds nice if you think of yourself as a single integer. But in fact, you're not a single integer. You're always part of a great mass of humans. And everything you do is going to have ramifications down to 7 generations. So if you're just looking at life as you sharpening yourself on a stone, that sounds pretty solipsistic to me. You can also sharpen yourself abating the suffering of others and helping others who are less fortunate and less wealthy and less entitled than you are develop power and agency.
And that's kind of a core principle of a lot of Buddhist teachings, isn't it? Not only the compassion and the sense of, I'll use a fancy word, eleemosynary, just meaning theologically, giving to others and philanthropic notions, but really extending oneself.
Well, here's where it comes from. So remember I talked about dependent origination, how everything's made of everything else? No sunlight, no leaves, no apple, no microbes in the soil, no apple. Because of that, Buddhists call this condition empty of self. So what they call emptiness is actually the kind of pregnant energy of the universe, which is always expressing itself as forms, turning into the millions and jillions of hummingbirds and insects and grasses and plants and cultures and languages. Well, once you know there's that emptiness itself is a common denominator, then it's easier to see every expression of it as essentially sacred, because that's what the universe is composed of. It's like every snowflake being different, but they're still composed of the universe. Every person, I may not like the fact that I'm made of the same thing as Donald Trump, but I am. And he has equal standing for his existence as I have for mine. I can't make my altercations with him based on my goodness or my idea of my own goodness, because any human being is the full spectrum of humanity. If we think we're the good guys, that's how we wind up bombing hotels in Baghdad in the middle of the night and killing men, women, and children in their beds because our leader doesn't like their leader. If we don't know that as a human being, we can be incredibly dangerous if we're not monitoring and minding our impulses and what we let past our tongue and animate our muscles, we're operating in a state of blissful ignorance, which happens far too often.
We're in a single universe, though. I keep coming back to the notion that modern physics tells us that we are in many infinite number of universes, probably. We can't even quantify how many universes. So when you talk about this universe, are you talking mainly about something that's constrained and circumscribed?
I have no idea. I don't know. I just try to deal with what's in front of me according to the Buddhist precepts. Am I being kind? Am I being helpful? Am I, hurting someone with this kind of speech or this kind of action?
Another question from Reed. He wants to know if you can explain, if possible, the popularity of Trump and the fact that around 50% of this country backs him.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and this is what I think, honestly. In 1968, there was a guy named Lewis Powell, who President Nixon later appointed to the Supreme Court. And Lewis Powell was furious at the protests of the students and the counterculture, and he was furious about the way that the universities and the schools began to support them and how a kind of leftist view began to permeate the culture. And he wrote a letter to the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's called the Powell Memo. You can read it on Google. And it was basically a 30-page plan, which the Republicans have followed in lockstep for 60 years to move America to the right, to use the power of big business to demand of TV that they laud the free enterprise system, that they go after college professors they thought were too liberal, that they go after school boards, that they go after all these issues. And this guy, Paul Weyrich, who I mentioned earlier, he invented the abortion issue out of whole cloth, because after the Civil Rights Bill passed, people couldn't talk racist talk anymore. They looked like crackers and rednecks. So he came up with this idea of the unborn as a kind of code that would unite conservative people together, and he created this. So we are living at the end of this spear that's been moving in lockstep with lots of money. They built think tanks with radio and TV broadcasting units in them. They scoured colleges for bright kids and sent them to Washington to study under conservatives. And so by the time Bill Clinton gets to be president, he turns the entire Democratic Party into a neoliberal institution, going after the same big money that the Republicans have been going after. And all along this, GATT and NAFTA has shifted jobs out. The savings and loan collapse, deregulation has ruined. The Midwest scored $250 billion of pensions out of the economy. And all the urban and rural blue collar who have been abandoned by both parties are basically the motive force that we saw in the White House. Democrats sat on a wage freeze for 30 years, along with Republicans, knowing that even at 2% interest over 30 years is wiping out savings, is wiping out buying power. So the reason I answered the guy who's building the factory for a couple thousand people is I applaud his energy, I applaud his inventiveness, but if he thinks he's doing it alone, that he's not being backed up by the law, by his education, by police forces, by all the accoutrements of the culture, which are overbalanced in favor of the wealthy, he's not looking at things the way they actually are. And so the suffering of people today is not an accident. Trump is not an accident. He's the product of a 60-year struggle that put Reagan in the White House, who declared that government was the enemy, who put Newt Gingrich in as the speaker, who declared the Democrats were evil. And they pursued this, and they pursued this with unlimited money and the same kind of hierarchical and vertical integration that business is so good at, while the Democrats are running around trying to put out a million fires. And that's how we got here.
Well, let me take you back for a second.
Sure.
I need to do this because I think you and I made a big mistake as young idealists back in another era. I was reading where you had said that you couldn't in good conscience vote for Humphrey. I felt the same way because of Vietnam. Remember, he called it a great adventure. But if many like us had voted for Humphrey, we may have had a whole different trajectory. Nixon might not have been the president, and things would have changed.
I just did a YouTube about this. I just made a 5-minute YouTube to young voters who are protesting the war in Gaza on either side, pro or anti-Israel, saying, I applaud your moral outrage. I applaud your commitment. I applaud your standing up. I'm 82. This is not my time. This is your time. But let me tell you about my time when me and my confreres made a terrible mistake, and maybe I can save you. And I told him about Vietnam and how our moral outrage led us to determine that Humphrey was too tepid to support. And we got Nixon. And then 2 presidents later, we got Reagan. And then we got Bush. And we had 25 years of right-wing deregulation, anti-women, anti-environment, pro-capitalist, pro-neoliberal. And I said that life is not a single issue experiment. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. We didn't understand Humphrey was on our side. He may have been the right wing on our side, but he was still not Reagan. And the worst Democrat will still be supporting the environment and women's rights and anti-racism. Yeah, we made that mistake. And so I'm going full bore to try to warn young people not to make it again.
Question from Abigail in San Diego. We're back to writing, and she wants to know, how do you approach the process of writing? What are your key influences?
That's a good question. Usually it's an impulse. Something starts to coagulate in my chest that I have to say. I do a lot of writing to newspapers. I'm lucky that the Press Democrat in my Sonoma County publishes a lot of my letters. So I have some impulse to communicate. And then I blurt it out. And then as I've gotten older, I study it and cut it down and thin it and try to make it as pungent and as trenchant as I can. And now I'm resurrecting a book that I wrote about 15 years ago called Lies We Love to Live, that no publisher would touch because it was too angry. And it's based on shibboleths, like we love our children. And then the chapter goes on to show what we've done to their education system, to the additives in their food, to putting them in classrooms with 40 kids in the class. And there's, nuclear, cheap, safe, and green, taking all these shibboleths. So I'm thinking of revising it and updating all the information because people don't really understand the economy they live in. They're not teaching civics anymore. They don't even understand how government works.
Here's Jeff again. With many once again finding themselves in actual danger of simply being Jewish, was there any element of identity concerns at the time of your name change?
No. My name change, I love being a Jew. My dad once said in an argument to some guy, he said, listen, while the Angles and the Celts and the Gauls were painting their faces blue and hanging in trees, the Jews were inventing monotheism, justice, and the law. I love that culture. I love that intellectual tradition. That my name change was a spiritual event. It was under some guidance, and it was initiated from a peyote experience. I've never been afraid of anti-Semites. I think that I'm as dangerous to them as they might be to me.
Coyotes are now becoming not necessarily as, shall we say, endearing to many people as they used to be, especially now that they're more in urban areas and attacking small dogs and cats and other mammals.
The nerve of those people that we move in and we set up a supermarket in their neighborhood and then we castigate them for shopping in it. What are we going to leave to nature? Let me just ask, what are we going to leave to other species on whom we're interdependent? And the coyotes are just being coyotes.
Well, but after the peyote experiment, you spoke to a Native American about this, I believe, didn't you?
Yeah, I was living with a guy named Rolling Thunder.
That's right.
And I was just fixing his toilets and keeping his trucks running and just trying to learn what I could learn. And I told him about this peyote experience where I turned into some kind of little wolf and I ran through the fields in Iowa, and I woke up in the morning, and I don't know if your viewers can see this, but I was in a cornfield that was filled with these little footprints all around me. And I didn't know if I had made them. I didn't know if animals had made them. And I didn't know what to do with it. So 4 or 5 years later, I was with Rolling Thunder, who was the Shoshone Paiute shaman and healer. And so he said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you got two choices. You can write it off as a hallucination. He says, okay, you'll stay a white man. You'll have a nice life. Things will be okay for you. Or you could consider that the universe opened its heart to you, and you could try to figure out what it meant. And you might become a human being. And so I liked the sound of that. So I thought about it for 3 months, and I changed the name as the first step in trying to understand what it meant. And there was an immediate unintended consequence. The shock of it is as fresh today as it was then, which was that no one on earth knew who Peter Coyote was, myself included. And I would only find out every time the rabbit came out of the bush by the way I responded. So it had nothing to do with fear of being identified as Jewish or anti-Semitism at all.
Well, now you're a Buddhist, and there are an incredible number of Jews who have turned to Buddhism.
I'm a Jew-Bood.
A Jew-Boo or a bagel Buddhist. I think about Norman Fisher, and I think about Jack Kornfield.
Yeah.
By the way, we did a splendid podcast with Jack. It's our 27th podcast for those of you interested in Buddhism, and one with Tenshin Reb Anderson. That's our 58th podcast that you can access on Spotify or get on Apple, or go to graymatter.show.
Those are my teachers.
Those are your your teachers.
Reb was one of my first Dharma friends. He really was helpful to me.
Well, I'm thinking, by the way, how would you define Dharma? Can you do that for us?
Dharma just means truth. I mean, it's used in a number of ways. The Dharma talk is the truth from a Buddhist perspective.
But it's used in so many different ways. I mean,
yeah, I know.
It's almost an elusive word in some respects because of its many meanings, its multiple meanings. I mentioned Jack Kornfield, and I remember a book he did, which the title always stayed with me, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry, which speaks to me of a lot of what Buddhism tells us about life, I think, doesn't it? I mean, when you can reach higher states of consciousness and then you still got to do the laundry afterward. That's the reality.
Yeah. I used to look at Grateful Dead concerts, and forgive me, but I saw acres of bad skin and I saw kids who were just like sacrificing matter for spirit. They had some idea that if the inside of their head was okay, that this physical stuff didn't matter at all. And they were, tattered and filthy and all of that. I think the thing about Jews is this cultural investigatory aspect, on the one hand, on the other hand. So that's very Buddhist. We say you never find gum under the table at a Buddhist restaurant because we always look at every side of things. So when I got to Zen Center, 80% of the people there were Jews.
Well, before I say goodbye to you and our listeners, I want to thank all of those who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, or on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, I invite you again to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Again, that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. I want to thank the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to this week's guest, Peter Coyote.
Michael, you could do this for a living.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.